My name is Claire Bennett, and for most of my life, I believed my grandmother's lake house was the safest place on earth. It sat on the quiet northern shore of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, surrounded by towering white pines that whispered whenever the wind rolled across the water. The house wasn't large or luxurious. The paint peeled from the porch railings every few years. The dock leaned slightly to one side, and the old screen door had complained with the same familiar squeak since I was a little girl. But to me, it wasn't just a house. It was every birthday cake Grandma Eleanor had baked from scratch, every 4th of July barbecue, every Christmas spent beside a stone fireplace that somehow made winter seem gentle, every fishing lesson Grandpa Henry had patiently given before he passed away. Some families inherit traditions. Ours lived inside those walls. Looking back now, I realize none of us truly understood what Grandma had been protecting all those years. We thought we were fighting over property. She knew we were really fighting over who we had become. At 38, my life looked respectable from the outside. I worked as a public school librarian in Madison. I had been divorced for 4 years, no children, a quiet apartment, a rescue golden retriever named Bailey who greeted me every evening as though I'd been gone for months instead of 8 hours. People often apologized when they heard I lived alone. I never corrected them. Loneliness and peace aren't the same thing. I'd learned that after my marriage ended. Grandma Eleanor understood that better than anyone. She never asked why the marriage failed. She simply kept setting another plate whenever I visited, as if she already knew some hurts don't need questions. Only company. Every other Saturday, I'd drive the 90 minutes to the lake. She would already be waiting on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. Mine always had too much cream. Exactly the way I'd liked it since college. "You still spoil me," I'd tease. She'd smile without looking up from her knitting. "No," she'd answer. "I just pay attention." It became our ritual. Coffee, long conversations, watching the sunlight dance across the water. Sometimes we'd speak for hours. Sometimes we'd sit in complete silence. Neither ever felt awkward. Grandma had a rare gift. She made silence feel like another language. My younger brother, Ryan, visited far less often. Running a successful real estate agency in Milwaukee kept him too busy, according to him. His wife, Vanessa, usually answered family texts before he did. She had opinions about everything, especially money, especially investments, especially what every piece of land was supposedly worth. Whenever the lake house came up in conversation, Vanessa's eyes always lingered a second too long on the shoreline outside the windows. "Do you know what waterfront property is selling for now?" She'd ask almost every visit. Grandma would simply stir her tea. "This isn't a listing." Vanessa would laugh. "I'm just saying." Grandma never argued. She rarely needed to. Her silence usually ended conversations faster than anger ever could. Then there was my cousin Mark. Technically, he was my mother's nephew, but we'd all grown up together. Mark bounced from one business venture to another. Restaurants, landscaping, online investments. None seemed to last very long. Yet somehow he always had an expensive truck parked outside. He loved talking about opportunities. Grandma called them distractions. One Thanksgiving, he stood on the dock studying the shoreline like a surveyor. "You know," he said, "a developer offered almost $3 million for a place not far from here." Nobody answered. He continued anyway. "This land is basically wasted as one little family cabin." Grandma finally looked up from slicing pumpkin pie. "Nothing is wasted if people are still making memories." Mark smiled politely. The kind of smile people wear when they think someone older simply doesn't understand modern life. Looking back. That was probably the first moment Grandma realized exactly what was coming. She never mentioned it to me, not directly. Instead, she started asking unusual questions. "What do you think people inherit?" I laughed. "That's easy." "No," she said softly. "It isn't." I shrugged. "Money, property, family keepsakes." She nodded slowly. "Those are possessions." She looked across the lake before continuing. "I'm asking about inheritance." At the time, I didn't understand the difference. I wish I had. Late that September, Grandma invited the entire family to the lake house. No birthday, no holiday, no explanation. Just one simple sentence in a handwritten card. "I'd like everyone here this Sunday." No one ignored Grandma Eleanor. By noon, every parking space around the gravel driveway was full. Ryan and Vanessa arrived in a brand new SUV. Mark pulled in behind them. My Aunt Denise came from Illinois. Even relatives I hadn't seen in nearly 2 years somehow found time to appear. It felt less like a family gathering and more like everyone expected something. Vanessa wandered through the kitchen making casual observations. This place could be gorgeous after renovations. Mark studied the dock again. Ryan asked whether Grandma had finally considered moving into assisted living. The conversation sounded harmless, but together, they formed a pattern. Only Grandma seemed to notice. She spent most of the afternoon quietly serving homemade chicken soup, refilling glasses, watching everyone. Not judging, simply observing, the way teachers notice which students finish helping clean the classroom and which disappear the moment work begins. As evening settled over the lake, Grandma stood. The room fell silent almost immediately. She wasn't physically imposing. She barely reached 5'3", but somehow she'd always been the strongest person any of us knew. She rested one hand against the back of her chair. I've lived in this house for 56 years. Nobody interrupted. I know many of you have wondered what will happen to it someday. Several people exchanged quick glances. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Mark leaned forward slightly. Ryan folded his hands together. Grandma smiled sadly. I imagine some of you already have plans. A nervous chuckle drifted across the room. No one admitted anything. Then she said something none of us expected. I've updated my will. Every fork stopped moving. Every conversation disappeared. Outside, waves tapped gently against the old wooden dock. Inside, you could almost hear people calculating, but Grandma wasn't finished. The attorney will read everything after I'm gone. Vanessa forced a polite smile. Well, hopefully that's many years away. Grandma looked directly at her. I hope so too. Then she reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She removed a small brass key. Old, worn smooth with age. She placed it quietly on the dining table. This, she said, belongs to whoever truly inherits the lake house. Ryan frowned. What does it open? Grandma smiled. You'll find out. Mark laughed. A safe? She didn't answer. Instead, she looked around the table one last time, slowly, carefully, almost as if memorizing each face. Then she spoke words I wouldn't fully understand until much later. Everyone thinks they're waiting to receive this house. She paused. They don't realize. Her eyes settled on mine for only a second. The house has been waiting to choose someone. At the time, I thought she was simply being poetic. I had no idea that hidden somewhere inside that old lake house was a promise so powerful. It would tear our family apart before it finally brought us back together. Grandma's gathering ended with hugs, leftover pie packed into plastic containers, and the same polite smiles families wear when they're thinking about something they don't want to say out loud. As I drove back to Madison that evening, the image of the old brass key stayed with me. Not because I believed it opened a treasure, because Grandma had never been theatrical. If she had placed that key on the table, it mattered. She simply wasn't the kind of woman who enjoyed mysteries for the sake of drama. Everything she did had a purpose. I just couldn't see it yet. The following week settled back into routine. School resumed after the summer break, and the library filled with students searching for history books they would probably never read, and novels they secretly hoped their teachers wouldn't assign. I loved that about my job. Books had taught me something people rarely did. The truth was almost always hiding in plain sight. Grandma and I continued our Saturday visits. Only now, something had changed. She seemed lighter, not happier, more at peace, almost as though she'd finally finished carrying something heavy. One rainy afternoon, while we watched drops dance across the lake, she surprised me with another unexpected question. Claire, do you know why old houses survive longer than new ones? I smiled. Better lumber? She chuckled. Partly. Then she looked toward the weathered beams crossing the living room ceiling. They survive because every generation repairs them before they're completely broken. She let those words settle between us. Families work the same way. At the time, I assumed she was simply reflecting on aging. Now I know she was trying to prepare me, without frightening me, without forcing me, just planting seeds she hoped would bloom later. About 2 weeks after that conversation, Ryan called. That alone was unusual. My brother preferred texting. Phone calls usually meant he wanted something. Hey, Claire! His voice sounded unusually cheerful. You busy this weekend? I'll be at Grandma's. Oh, a brief silence followed. Actually, Vanessa and I were thinking about driving up there too. I smiled. She'll love that. Yeah. Another pause. Then he asked what sounded like an innocent question. Has Grandma mentioned anything else about the will? I stared through my apartment window. No. You sure? Ryan, I'm just asking. His tone stayed light. Too light. We're all curious. We should be focused on spending time with her. I know. But she's 84. I just think we should be prepared. Prepared. It was such a practical word, yet somehow it left a bitter taste. We ended the conversation politely. Still, for the first time in my life, I hung up wondering whether my brother had called to ask about Grandma, or about the lake house. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in thick autumn fog. The lake looked almost invisible beneath the mist. Grandma was already sweeping leaves from the porch when I pulled into the driveway. You know I can do that. I know, she smiled, but then what excuse would I have to enjoy the morning? I laughed and took the broom from her anyway. She pretended to resist. Neither of us fooled the other. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon, coffee, and old cedar. Exactly as it always had. Nothing ever felt rushed there. Even time seemed to slow down. We spent the morning organizing boxes in the upstairs attic. Grandma insisted she was decluttering. I suspected she simply wanted company. Dust floated through the sunlight as we sorted decades of memories. Christmas ornaments, Grandpa's fishing gear, yellowed recipe books, photo albums so heavy they felt like pieces of history. At one point, I opened an old wooden trunk. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. I've never seen these. Grandma glanced over. They're mine. From Grandpa? She smiled softly. Some. And the others? My father. I carefully returned them without reading another word. She noticed. Thank you. For what? You understood they weren't yours. It seemed like such a small moment. Later, I'd realized she was quietly measuring something much more important than curiosity. She was measuring respect. Around lunchtime, another car pulled into the driveway. Ryan and Vanessa. Neither had mentioned they were definitely coming. Vanessa stepped out carrying an expensive bakery box. I brought pastries. Grandma hugged her warmly. She hugged everyone warmly. That was simply who she was. Ryan wandered through the house while we ate. I forgot how much space this place has. It feels bigger every time I visit. Vanessa nodded. You could easily modernize everything without changing the charm. Grandma buttered another biscuit. It isn't asking to be modernized. Vanessa laughed. I'm just saying what buyers usually love. Buyers. There it was again. Not memories, not family. Buyers. Grandma simply changed the subject. She had mastered the art of refusing an argument without anyone realizing she'd refused it. After lunch, Ryan asked if I could help him move some old kayaks from the boathouse. We walked toward the dock together. The cold air smelled like pine needles and lake water. Once we were out of earshot, he lowered his voice. So? You really think Grandma's leaving the house to one person? I have no idea. What if she does? I guess that's her decision. He kicked a loose stone into the water. Seems unfair. Why? We're all family. Not everyone contributes equally. The words escaped before I could soften them. Ryan looked at me. You think I don't care? I think you've been here twice this year. I've been working. So have I. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. You always make me feel guilty. I wasn't trying to. I know. He looked back at the house. I just don't want this place leaving the family. Neither did I, but somehow, the way he said it made me wonder whether we meant the same thing. That evening, after Ryan and Vanessa left, Grandma and I sat on the porch wrapped in blankets. The lake reflected hundreds of tiny stars. Without looking at me, she asked quietly, Did you notice? Notice what? The questions. I thought about it. Ryan, Vanessa, the constant comments, the value, the renovations, the buyers. I nodded slowly. They're worried. No. She gently shook her head. They're calculating. The distinction hit harder than I expected. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Greed rarely arrives looking greedy. It usually arrives looking practical. I looked toward the dark shoreline. The old boathouse stood in silhouette beneath the moonlight, peaceful, timeless, untouchable, or so I believed. Grandma closed her eyes for a moment before speaking again. "Promise me something. Anything. When the time comes..." She opened her eyes. "Don't make decisions too quickly." I frowned. "What time?" She smiled with that quiet wisdom I'd trusted since childhood. "You'll know." A cold breeze drifted across the lake. Somewhere in the darkness, the old wind chime hanging beside the porch rang once, though there wasn't enough wind to move it. For reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly felt as though the lake house itself was listening and waiting. Winter arrived quietly that year. The lake froze from the edges inward, covering the water with a sheet of silver that reflected the pale December sky. The pine trees carried fresh snow on their branches, and the old lake house looked exactly as it always had. Steady, patient, almost timeless. I wanted to believe nothing would ever change. Life has a cruel way of waiting until you feel safe. 3 weeks before Christmas, my phone rang just after 6 in the morning. No one calls that early with good news. When I saw the hospital's number, I already knew. Grandma Eleanor had suffered a stroke during the night. She had been conscious when the ambulance arrived. She had even insisted on locking the front door before leaving. That sounded exactly like her. By the time I reached the hospital, snow was falling so heavily that the parking lot looked untouched despite dozens of cars. Ryan was already there. Vanessa stood beside him, unusually quiet. Mark arrived a few minutes later, still wearing his business suit beneath an expensive winter coat. For once, nobody talked about real estate. Nobody talked about money. We were simply a family waiting outside a hospital room. The doctor met us after nearly an hour. "I'm sorry." Sometimes 2 words are enough to divide a life into before and after. Grandma Eleanor passed away peacefully just after sunrise. She was 84 years old. The funeral took place 4 days later. Nearly the entire town attended. That surprised none of us. Grandma had spent decades volunteering at the church, organizing food drives, teaching children to read during the summers, and quietly helping families who never even realized where anonymous donations had come from. She never wanted recognition. She believed kindness worked best when nobody was keeping score. As people shared stories about her, I realized something I had never fully appreciated. Grandma hadn't built wealth. She had built trust. Those are very different legacies. After the service, dozens of neighbors hugged me. One elderly man held my hands and smiled through tears. "Your grandmother saved my farm back in '97. I blinked. I didn't know that." "She made sure you wouldn't." He smiled again. "That's how she liked it." Every conversation revealed another act of quiet generosity, another life she had touched, another burden she had carried without telling anyone. Driving away from the cemetery, I couldn't stop thinking about something she had once told me. People remember what you protected far longer than what you owned. Only then did I begin wondering, what exactly had she been protecting? A week later, Daniel Foster, Grandma's attorney, invited the family to his office for the reading of the will. The building overlooked the courthouse square, its brick walls carrying more than a century of history. Everything inside smelled faintly of leather-bound books and fresh coffee. The conference room felt strangely formal. Ryan sat beside Vanessa. Mark chose the chair closest to the attorney. My Aunt Denise quietly folded her hands in her lap. I sat near the window. No one spoke much. Grief has a way of making silence louder. Or perhaps it wasn't only grief sitting in that room. Mr. Foster adjusted his glasses before opening a thick leather folder. "I first want to say that Eleanor Bennett prepared these documents herself over many months." He paused. "She revised them several times." Vanessa glanced toward Ryan. Mark leaned forward. The attorney continued. "Personal belongings have been distributed individually." He read through jewelry, family photographs, Grandpa's fishing equipment, charitable donations, savings accounts. Everything was handled thoughtfully. Fairly. No one objected. Then he reached the final section. The lake house. The room became completely still. Even the heating vents seemed quieter. Mr. Foster looked up before reading. "Eleanor requested that this portion be read exactly as written." He unfolded a handwritten page, not typed, written in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting. If you are hearing this, Then I hope you've spent more time remembering the lake than calculating its value. No one moved. This house has never belonged to one person alone. Every generation borrowed it from the next. I felt tears forming before I realized why. It sounded exactly like her voice. Warm, patient, certain. The attorney continued. Many people believe inheritance is a reward. I have always believed it is a responsibility. Ryan lowered his eyes. Vanessa's fingers tightened around her notebook. Mark stared straight ahead. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The lake house shall not be sold, divided, mortgaged, or commercially developed. Mark blinked. Vanessa frowned. Mr. Foster kept reading. Its ownership will pass to one individual, selected according to the conditions contained in the second document. The second document? Ryan interrupted. I don't understand. I'm afraid, the attorney replied calmly, your grandmother specifically instructed me not to explain until everyone had heard the complete statement. The room fell silent again. He continued. The brass key you all saw during our final family dinner opens a small cedar box hidden somewhere inside the lake house. Every head lifted, even mine. Inside that box is the promise I have protected for more than 30 years. I remembered the key immediately. The worn brass, the way she'd placed it gently on the dining table, the way she'd looked at each of us afterward. Mr. Foster closed the handwritten letter. That concludes the first document. Ryan frowned. So, who gets the house? The attorney reached into another folder, instead of answering. He placed the old brass key onto the conference table. Its soft metallic sound echoed through the room. This, he said quietly, is where Eleanor's real will begins. No one spoke. Outside the office window, snow drifted slowly across the courthouse lawn. Inside. For the first time, I realized Grandma hadn't left us a lake house. She had left us a test. And somehow, I already feared that not everyone in that room intended to pass it. For several long seconds, no one reached for the brass key. It rested in the middle of the conference table exactly where Mr. Foster had placed it, its worn surface catching the afternoon light coming through the office windows. It looked ordinary. Too ordinary. Certainly not important enough to change the future of an entire family. But Grandma had never confused value with appearance. She knew the difference. Mr. Foster folded his hands. Eleanor instructed me to accompany the family to the lake house immediately after today's meeting. Mark frowned. Today? Yes. Why the rush? Because, the attorney answered calmly, she believed waiting would only give people time to argue. For the first time all afternoon, I almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Grandma. Even after she was gone, she was still keeping us moving before resentment had the chance to grow. The drive to the lake felt strangely different. Nobody spoke much. Ryan drove behind my car. Mark followed in his truck. Snow continued falling, covering the familiar roads with fresh white powder. When I finally turned into the gravel driveway, seeing the lake house without Grandma standing on the porch felt almost unbearable. The porch swing hung perfectly still. No coffee waited on the small table. No smoke curled from the chimney. The house looked the same. Everything inside me knew it wasn't. I stood for several moments before walking toward the front door. Mr. Foster handed me the brass key. Eleanor specifically requested that you unlock the house. My fingers tightened around it. Me? He simply nodded. Those were her instructions. Behind me, I felt Vanessa notice. I didn't have to look. Some silences carry emotion all by themselves. The familiar smell greeted me the moment I opened the door. Cedar, old books, firewood, cinnamon. It was almost comforting enough to make me forget why we were there. Almost. Everyone entered quietly. Even Mark seemed uncomfortable disturbing the silence. Mr. Foster unfolded another handwritten page. This contains Eleanor's final instructions. He adjusted his glasses before reading. The cedar box is hidden exactly where Henry and I always believed it would be safest. Ryan whispered, "What does that even mean?" The attorney continued, "If you truly knew this house, you already know where to begin." That was all. No map, no explanation, nothing more. Mark sighed loudly. "Seriously?" Vanessa crossed her arms. "This could take days." Mr. Foster smiled politely. Eleanor seemed comfortable with that possibility. The search began. At first, everyone searched the way people usually do when looking for something valuable. Fast, carelessly, opening drawers, checking cabinets, looking behind picture frames. Mark headed upstairs almost immediately. Ryan began searching closets. Vanessa examined every shelf in the living room. I didn't move. Instead, I stood quietly in the center of the room, listening, remembering. If Grandma had hidden something important, she wouldn't have hidden it somewhere random. She would have hidden it somewhere meaningful. That had always been her way. I slowly walked toward the kitchen. The old cast-iron stove still stood where it always had. Beside it sat Grandpa's rocking chair. No. Too obvious. I moved toward the screened porch. Nothing. The attic? Possible. The basement? Maybe. But none of those places felt right. Then my eyes stopped on the fireplace. Above it hung Grandpa Henry's hand-carved wooden paddle. It had never been removed. Not once. I remembered asking about it when I was 10 years old. Grandpa had smiled and said, "Some things belong exactly where they are." I walked closer, touched the paddle. Nothing. Still. Something tugged at my memory. Not the paddle, the fireplace. Suddenly, I remembered countless winter evenings watching Grandma clean the stone hearth. Every single time. She always paused at one particular stone. Every single time. Why? Behind me, Mark laughed from upstairs. "There's nothing here," Ryan answered from another room. "Keep looking." I knelt in front of the fireplace. The stones looked identical. Except one carried slightly less soot than the others, almost as though someone had touched it repeatedly over many years. I pressed it gently. Nothing happened. Vanessa walked into the room. "What are you doing?" "I don't know yet." She sighed. "We should be checking closets." I barely heard her. Instead, I pushed harder. The stone shifted, only slightly. A tiny click echoed inside the chimney. Every conversation in the house stopped. "What was that?" Ryan called. I carefully slid the stone sideways. Behind it, a narrow iron compartment appeared inside the chimney wall. Nobody spoke. Inside rested a small cedar box, no larger than a family Bible. Its wood had darkened with age. Across the lid, Grandpa had carved a single word decades earlier. Promise. I felt goosebumps rise along my arms. Grandma hadn't hidden treasure. She had hidden a commitment. Mr. Foster stepped beside me. I believe this is what Eleanor intended us to find. He looked toward the brass key still resting in my hand. It should fit. My hands trembled for the first time since Grandma died. I inserted the key. The old lock resisted. Then, with one soft click, it opened. Inside wasn't cash, no jewelry, no property deed. Instead, there were only 3 items. A sealed envelope addressed simply, "To the one who chooses the lake before themselves." Beneath it rested a faded leather journal, and underneath both, an old black and white photograph. Grandpa Henry, Grandma Eleanor, and standing beside them, a little boy none of us recognized. Ryan frowned. "Who is that?" No one answered, because no one knew. Mr. Foster carefully picked up the sealed envelope. His expression changed the moment he recognized the handwriting. He looked around the room before speaking quietly. "I think, he swallowed. "Your grandmother has one final story to tell." And somehow, looking at the unknown child smiling beside my grandparents, I realized everything we believed about our family's history was about to change forever. No one spoke. The only sound inside the lake house was the fire settling in the stone fireplace, the same quiet crackling that had filled countless evenings during my childhood. Mr. Foster held the sealed envelope carefully, almost reverently. For a moment, he didn't open it. Instead, he looked at each of us. Eleanor instructed me to read this only after the cedar box had been found. He broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter. I recognized Grandma's handwriting immediately. Even before he spoke, it felt like hearing her voice again. He began reading. "If you are listening to this letter, then you've already discovered something important." He paused. "The lake house was never the inheritance." Everyone remained silent. "The inheritance has always been the promise." Mark shifted impatiently. Vanessa folded her arms. Ryan kept staring at the old photograph. Mr. Foster continued. Many years ago, your grandfather and I made a decision that changed this family's future. I leaned forward without realizing it. We promised that this house would never become another investment. The words hung in the room. Homes can become assets overnight. A family home becomes sacred only after generations choose people over profit. I felt my throat tighten, because suddenly, I understood why Grandma never discussed the market value of the property. To her, the value had never been measured in dollars. Mr. Foster turned the page. His expression softened. You were probably wondering about the little boy in the photograph. Every pair of eyes returned to the faded picture. The child couldn't have been older than 8. He stood proudly beside Grandpa, holding a fishing pole almost taller than himself. Grandma smiled warmly beside them. Who was he? The attorney continued. His name was Samuel. None of us recognized it. Samuel was not related to us by blood. Vanessa frowned. Ryan exchanged a confused look with me. He lived next door with his parents. When they died in a boating accident, he spent nearly every summer here until distant relatives took him away. The room remained completely still. Grandma's words continued. Your grandfather taught him to fish from this dock. I taught him to bake bread in this kitchen. He reminded us that family is sometimes chosen long before it is inherited. I felt tears burning behind my eyes. Grandma had never spoken about Samuel. Not once. Mark finally broke the silence. What happened to him? Mr. Foster lowered the letter. Eleanor didn't write that part. A heavy quiet settled over the room. Then he continued reading. The promise your grandfather and I made began because of Samuel. Everyone listened even more carefully now. After losing his parents, he once asked whether anyone could lose a home even if they still remembered it. I swallowed hard. Henry answered that a house disappears only when people stop caring for one another inside it. The attorney looked up briefly. I believe that sentence meant a great deal to Eleanor. No one argued. No one could. Then came the paragraph that changed the atmosphere completely. The lake house will belong only to the family member willing to protect it under one condition. Ryan looked up. Mark leaned forward. Even Vanessa uncrossed her arms. Mr. Foster read slowly. Every summer, for at least 1 week, this house must be opened freely to families who have experienced loss, hardship, or displacement and cannot afford a vacation together. Silence. Complete silence. The attorney continued. No rent. No publicity. No photographs. No recognition. Only kindness. Vanessa blinked. You mean, Mark interrupted, people we've never met? Mr. Foster nodded. That is exactly what Eleanor wrote. Ryan frowned. Every single year? Yes, for as long as the house remains in the family. Mark let out a short laugh. That's ridiculous. No one answered him. He shook his head. Do you realize how much rental income this place could generate? There it was. The first crack. Not in the house. In the family. Grandma's letter wasn't finished. If anyone believes this condition is unfair, Mr. Foster smiled faintly, they are free to refuse the inheritance. The room became even quieter, because the person who protects this home must understand something simple. He took a slow breath before reading the final sentence. The lake gave our family peace for generations. Now our family must return that peace to others. I closed my eyes. I could almost hear Grandma saying those words herself. Gentle, steady, certain. Mark stood first. So, that's it? Mr. Foster nodded. Not quite. Mark looked irritated. What now? The final document determines who will receive ownership. Ryan looked relieved. So, Grandma already chose? Mr. Foster slowly closed the letter. No. She created a process. Vanessa frowned. What kind of process? The attorney reached into the cedar box one last time. Until then. None of us had noticed there was a false wooden bottom. He lifted it carefully. Beneath it rested 6 sealed envelopes. Each carried one family member's name. Mine, Ryan's, Mark's, Vanessa's, Aunt Denise's, and one addressed simply, to whoever still believes this house is a home. My heartbeat quickened. Mr. Foster looked at us with the same calm expression he'd worn all afternoon. Eleanor instructed me to hand each of you your envelope. He paused, but she also gave one final instruction. He looked directly at me. You are not allowed to open them today. A chorus of confused voices filled the room. What? Why? That makes no sense. Mr. Foster waited until everyone fell silent again. Then he quietly delivered Grandma's last instruction. Return here exactly 30 days from today. He glanced around the room. Only those who choose to come back will still be part of Eleanor's final decision. And somehow, I had the feeling Grandma wasn't testing our patience. She was testing our hearts. For the next 30 days, Grandma never left my thoughts. Her envelope sat unopened on my kitchen table. Every morning before leaving for work, I'd see my name written in her careful handwriting. Every evening, I'd fight the temptation to break the seal. I never did. A promise made to Grandma still felt like a promise, even after she was gone. I often wondered whether everyone else was keeping theirs. The answer came much sooner than I expected. About a week after the reading of the will, Ryan called. His voice sounded exhausted. I need to tell you something. What happened? He sighed. Mark's trying to convince everyone to challenge the will. I wasn't surprised. On what grounds? He says Grandma wasn't thinking clearly. The words hit me like ice water. My grandmother spent months planning this. I know. He also says the condition about letting families stay here is unreasonable. I looked out my apartment window. No. It isn't. Ryan hesitated. I don't think so anymore either. That was the first time I'd heard uncertainty instead of ambition in his voice. Something inside him had begun to change. A few days later, Aunt Denise invited me to lunch. She quietly slid an envelope across the table. It wasn't Grandma's. It was hers. I've decided not to open it. I stared at her. You can do that? She smiled. I already know what your grandmother wanted from me. What? To stop worrying about what I'd receive. She pushed the envelope back into her purse. I've already received it. Those words stayed with me for the rest of the drive home. Maybe that was Grandma's greatest gift. She had somehow made people examine themselves instead of each other. Not everyone reacted that way. Mark became increasingly angry. Family group messages turned into arguments. He hired an attorney. He talked openly about contesting the restrictions. Vanessa supported him. Ryan remained unusually quiet. One evening he admitted why. I drove to the lake. By yourself? Yeah. What for? I don't know. He laughed softly. I guess I wanted to remember what it felt like before we started talking about money. I smiled. And? I sat on Grandpa's dock for 2 hours. He paused. I finally realized I couldn't remember the last time I watched the sunset there. His voice cracked. I'd forgotten why I loved that place. For the first time in years. My brother sounded like my brother again. 30 days passed. Snow slowly melted. The first signs of spring appeared around the shoreline. Exactly 1 month after the reading of the will, I drove back to the lake house. Grandma had been right. The driveway itself answered part of her test. Only 3 cars were there. Mine, Ryan's, Aunt Denise's. Mark never came. Vanessa didn't either. Neither did the distant cousins who had suddenly shown interest after Grandma mentioned updating her will. The house felt peaceful, almost relieved. Mr. Foster greeted us at the front door. He looked toward the nearly empty driveway and nodded quietly. I believe Eleanor expected this. Inside, everything looked exactly as we had left it. The cedar box rested on the dining table. Beside it sat 3 unopened envelopes. Mine, Ryan's, Aunt Denise's. Mr. Foster spoke gently. You may open them now. For a long moment, none of us moved. Then I carefully broke the seal. Inside was only a single handwritten page. No legal language, no conditions, just Grandma. Claire, if you're reading this, then you chose to come back without knowing what you would receive. That tells me more than any conversation ever could. Tears blurred the page. I continued reading. This house never needed the richest member of the family. It never needed the smartest. It needed the one willing to stay. My hands trembled. For years, I watched who repaired broken chairs without being asked. who washed dishes after dinner, who remembered birthdays, who listened when someone was hurting. Inheritance is revealed in ordinary moments. I couldn't stop crying, because every memory came rushing back. Every Saturday, every quiet conversation, every cup of coffee. Grandma hadn't been evaluating us for 1 month. She had been watching for years. Ryan quietly wiped his eyes. I think. He smiled through tears. I already know what yours says. I looked at him. He unfolded his own letter. My letter says, he laughed softly, that my greatest inheritance was getting another chance to become the brother you deserved. Neither of us spoke. We simply hugged. A real hug, the kind we hadn't shared since we were children. Across the table, Aunt Denise smiled. My letter says my job was never to own the house. What does it say? To make sure whoever does is never alone. That sounded exactly like Grandma. She hadn't divided the family. She had given each of us a purpose. Mr. Foster finally opened the last document. The ownership of the lake house shall pass to my granddaughter, Claire Bennett. He looked at me kindly. Effective immediately. I couldn't speak. Not because I had won, because it didn't feel like winning. It felt like accepting a responsibility far greater than myself. The attorney continued. Eleanor also established a charitable trust to cover the annual maintenance of the property, provided the promise is honored every year. Grandma had thought of everything. She knew kindness also needed practical support. That first summer, Ryan and I cleaned every room together. We repaired the old dock. We repainted the porch railings. We planted Grandma's favorite hydrangeas beside the front steps. Then, in June, the first family arrived, a young widow named Melissa, her 2 children, and their grandfather. They had lost Melissa's husband to cancer 8 months earlier. They hadn't taken a vacation in years. When the little boy caught his first fish from Grandpa Henry's dock, he ran across the yard laughing so hard that everyone else started laughing too, even his mother, especially his mother. That evening, I sat alone on the porch with a mug of coffee, for just a second. I could almost imagine Grandma sitting beside me, knitting quietly as the sun disappeared behind the lake. I finally understood the promise hidden inside the cedar box. It had never been about protecting a house. Houses grow old. Wood eventually rots. Paint always fades. The promise was about protecting what happened inside those walls. Hope, healing, second chances. Things no storm could wash away. Every summer afterward, another family came. Some arrived carrying grief. Some arrived carrying exhaustion. All of them left carrying memories. And every time I locked the front door at the end of the season, I smiled at the old brass key resting in my hand, because Grandma had been right all along. Everyone wanted the lake house. Almost no one wanted the promise hidden inside it, but in the end, the promise became the greatest inheritance any of us could have received.